It's 3:15, so we're going to go ahead and get started. This is the session Interpreting Controversy, Preserving and Presenting the Story of Joe Hill. My name is Jim Kichas, and panelist presenters with me here are Jeremy Harmon and Quinn Rollins. We'll each take a few minutes to do our own introductions at the beginning, what we're going for with this panel is we're each going to take about 15 to 20 minutes presenting on different parts of this Joe Hill story, and then at the end we'll have time for questions from anybody in the audience. So with that, I will go ahead and get us rolling. Okay. So again, my name is Jim Kichas, and I'm with the Utah State Archives and Record Service. I've been with the State Archives for nearly 15 years, serving first as a processing and reference archivist. I was originally hired to process the records of former Governor Scott Matheson, and then went on to work as a processing and reference archivist on a number of different projects at the State Archives over my career. Then became the program coordinator for our Archives and Patron Services section, so sort of the bureau chief over our permanent record collection and how people access it. And now I'm currently in my role as assistant director of the institution. So what is the Utah State Archives and Record Service? We are the institutional repository for state and local government records in Utah. In addition to providing records management services to state and local government agencies, we also serve as the institutional repository for state and local government. So that means that we take in the permanent and historic records of Utah government and make sure that they are preserved and that they remain accessible to the citizens of Utah. My first experience working with Joe Hill and the Joe Hill records at the State Archives came as part of our annual Archives Month celebration in 2015. Archives Month is held every October. It's an opportunity to for the archives and special collections of Utah to highlight themselves, highlight their collections, build up interest. And in 2015, we decided that we were going to take the Joe Hill records in our collection, digitize them, and make them available online as part of this, I don't want to say celebration, as part of the anniversary of his 1915 execution in Utah. So I was able to go through those records, get them prepped, get them ready for posting online, and that's going to be a bulk of what I talk about are those records that you can actually access that are preserved by the Utah State Archives. I also added some experience as part of that, putting together some digital exhibits, so got to know the records fairly well going through them and picking out the ones that were of sort of the most interest, I think, to sort of highlight and tell this story. So, first of all, kind of a roadmap of where I'm going to be going in my portion of this. First, I would like to provide a very brief synopsis of the Joe Hill story so that we all kind of have a shared understanding of the records that I'll be eventually running through and that each of us are really talking about here. Secondly, I'd like to offer some of my brief thoughts on the why behind why we preserve historic records and primary source materials, why that is a valuable enterprise, and why we need to be advocates for it and continue to do it. And finally, I'd like to offer up some examples of some of the pieces of the Joe Hill story that as I mentioned, are held in the collections of the Utah State Archives. All right, so if you'll bear with me, there are probably experts in this room who know a lot more about the Joe Hill story than I do, but just so that we're all kind of have a common understanding, I'm going to read the brief narrative we put together for our digital archive page that kind of just lays the groundwork for the story. So what we've put online says, born in 1879 in Gavell, Sweden, Joseph Hillstrom, also known as Joe Hill, immigrated to the United States in 1902 and worked in a variety of jobs, including as a laborer, a miner, lumberman, and longshoreman. The often brutal working conditions he witnessed led him to join the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, where he became a renowned singer and songwriter of the early 20th century labor movement. In 1913, Joe Hill came to Utah and found work in the mines of Park City. On January 10, 1914, a murder was committed in Salt Lake that resulted in the deaths of grocery store owner John Morrison and his son Arling. The same night, Joe Hill appeared at the office of Dr. Frank M. McHugh with a gunshot wound to the chest. Suspicion soon fell on Hill as a suspect for the murder of Morrison and his son, based on the gunshot wound, which would have presumably been inflicted from return fire from Morrison, and circumstantial evidence that was brought to the trial. Hill was convicted of the murders of the Morrisons, and his execution was scheduled for late 1915. The trial engendered international debate over Hill's conviction and whether his activity as a labor organizer had made him a target of powerful political and business interests in the West. But while the execution was delayed, the conviction was not overturned, and Hill was executed by firing squad at the Utah State Prison in Sugar House on November 19, 1915. So, now that we have that groundwork laid, I kind of want to move into, this is very high level, sort of the top three things that come to mind for me about why I do what I do, why my colleagues do what we do, why the professional community does what it does to preserve our primary sources and preserve our records, and why it's important. The first, and I think it's important to ask this question because it's not easy to do, it's not cheap to do. You have to maintain physical and intellectual control over records is not an easy endeavor. So why do we do this? The first I'm calling puzzling out the bigger historical picture. Primary source records and documents are like puzzle pieces. The more that are saved and preserved, the deeper and richer the historical perspective will be. In the archival field currently, there's a very big focus that's being paid on gathering and preserving sources of historically underrepresented communities, and we're already seeing the outcomes of this being fairly dramatic. The more different pieces we get, the deeper and richer the story becomes. If we only had the story and the perspective of the Utah State Archives for Joe Hill, it would only be from the state's perspective, and it wouldn't be as deep and rich as historians have come to make it through their narrative by going to other sources. The second, I'm calling the thrill of unexpected connections. I think for anyone who's conducted historical research with primary source materials, you inevitably end up making connections that you didn't intend, didn't expect. Things happen that you weren't expecting, and it really becomes kind of an animating force for research. Research can oftentimes become tedious, it can be grinding, it can be frustrating, and those connections make it worthwhile and really make you say, that was cool, that was worth it. And then finally, I'm a third sort of big umbrella term or umbrella phrase, developing life skills of critical thinking, contextual thinking, and source literacy. I think that preserving a rich depth of primary source material offers the opportunity to teach others the literacy skills necessary to fully comprehend and understand those primary sources. Primary sources are not easy. They demand critical and contextual thinking. You have to put them in their place and understand how they sit within a context. And I think being able to think critically and in context are not just skills that you use in the historical research arena. Those are life skills, and the preservation of records offers the medium to build those skills, I think particularly in our younger communities. So with all that said, let's get on to what we actually have about Joe Hill at the Utah State Archives. I think the first place to start is telling you where you would actually access these records. We've placed them online on our online digital archives. Our digital archives provides 24/7 access to currently over 1.2 million digital images of government records. And it's a wide variety. We have the Joe Hill records. We also have birth and death records. We have court records, naturalization records. So a lot, and it's continually growing. We're always trying to identify the needs of the citizens of Utah and get records digitized and put online for their access to speed up access, make things easier for the citizens of the state. So I have put up the web address. If you also go to archives.utah.gov and go to the Research Our Records portion, you'll find a link to the digital archives. So once you are on the digital archives page, you'll see a link that says the State of Utah versus Joe Hill. When you click on that, it'll bring you into a portal page where we've actually put together all of our Joe Hill records that have been digitized, walk you through step by step, which is what I intend to do here, to give you an overview of what these records are and what you're going to find when you go online and see them. We refer to our records are grouped by record series, so there's a series number attached. That's how we know when you come in to do research how we're going to provide access to you. So when I refer to a series number, that's what that means. So what do we have? First off, series 328 the prison pardon application that Joe Hill submitted to the Utah Board of Pardons on September 1st, 1915. In addition to the pardon application in this file, Hill's case file also includes petitions for and against his sentence being commuted or pardoned, court records from his trial, and a published opinion on Hill's case from the Utah Supreme Court. As far as I know, I think you should be able to see it up on the side there. As far as I know, it's the only document that contains Joe Hill's actual handwriting and his signature in our holdings. You can see that he signed it as Joseph Hillstrom. The next record series I wanted to cover, Series 2941. These are the correspondence from 1914 to 1916, both to and from the office of Utah Governor William Spry concerning the Joe Hill case. As chief executive of the state of Utah, the governor had the authority to commute Hill's sentence. The conviction and execution of Joe Hill became one of the most controversial crimes in Utah's history, and it generated great national and international interest. The correspondence in this series is most often in the form of letters, postcards, and telegrams. And the item that is up on the screen right there is a correspondence from August 20th, 1915 from socialist leader and IWW founding member Eugene Debs to William Spry in support of the governor issuing executive clemency for Joe Hill. Two more items of interest from that record series. The item on your left is a telegram from September 30th, 1915 from U.S. President Woodrow Wilson to William Spry asking for a postponement of Joe Hill's execution until the Swedish minister presented his views on the case. And the item on the right is a correspondence from July 29th, 1914 from the Tonopah Local Socialist Party to William Spry stating their support of Joe Hill and their protest against his trial and his impending execution by the state of Utah. Our next record series, Series 6645, these are petitions from 1914 to 1916 that came in from across the world to William Spry protesting the conviction and execution of Joe Hill, as well as pleas to the governor to commute his sentence. The item you're seeing there is a printed petition with member signatures from the industrial workers of the world to William Spry protesting the impending execution. And in this record series, you just see volumes of this pre-printed petition with just signature after signature on them from all over the world. Next series, Series 6642. These are case records from 1915 to 1916 that were gathered by William Spry's office at the time of the Joe Hill trial and execution. This series includes newspaper clippings, a funeral oration for Hill, essays on radicalism, and interestingly, a series of reports from private detectives written shortly before and after Hill's execution that described their sanctioned surveillance activities on the Salt Lake City headquarters of the IWW. The item you're seeing on this screen is a September 28, 1915 summons from the Board of Pardons, signed by William Spry, ordering Torald Arnoldson, Oscar Larson, Virginia Snow Stephen, and Sigrid Bolin to appear before the Board of Pardons, and the summons was made because of possible knowledge that they might have pertaining to the Joe Hill case. Two more items from that same record series. The one on your left is an advertisement from the International Workers of the World that they published, urging citizens to write to William Spry in protest of Utah's legal murder of Joe Hill. And the other item on the screen is one of those official reports submitted to William Spry from a private investigator who was hired to provide that surveillance on the IWW. This is a lengthy letter pretty much talking about his days sitting there observing things I believe in the IWW office, and it's dated November 26, 1915. And then the last piece that I wanted to cover is Joe Hill's death certificate. Beginning in 1905, state law required that all births and deaths in the state of Utah be documented by a birth or death certificate. And the Department of Health took over that function, so Joe Hill died in the state of Utah. We have his death certificate. And in a lot of ways, I think it's kind of one of the more humanizing records of both him and the event that we see. It's only one page, but it contains a lot of interesting information. For example, it lists his occupation as musician. It also lists his cause of death as gunshot wounds, and tells that his remains were deposed to Chicago for his funeral and eventual cremation. And so with that, that's my portion of things. I hope that this very, very brief tour of the Joe Hill records held at the Utah State Archives has provided some insights on the need for documenting and preserving historic records, and that we all need to be advocates for this. And I encourage you, if this catches your interest or anything with our digital archives sounds interesting, to continue to explore. I've included my contact information here. I'm always happy to try and help facilitate research or assist in research in any way possible. So with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Jeremy.
Show my pictures.
Can you minimize that screen? Or just close it.
So yours should be all on the bottom here.
Okay, sorry, I'm a Mac guy, so
You're fine.
I am a little lost. Okay, can you guys see that letter? Okay, cool. All right, my name's Jeremy Harmon. I work at the Salt Lake Tribune. A couple years ago, we also wanted to do a big series of stories explaining the Joe Hill case and the centennial and why it still resonated with so many people. I'd read a couple of books about Joe Hill when this came up, so I kind of thought I knew a lot about it. And the editors meeting that we were in when this idea came up, I got really excited and just started blah 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 blah. And so it was like, well, and it looks like Jeremy's in charge of it. And so I was thrilled. This is a story I'm really interested in, and so we didn't want to just rehash what was in the books, and so we, started trying to figure out where we could go to, start doing some of our own research and some of our own reporting, and so we learned about the big stash of letters, and I don't know how many hours I spent over there going through and reading all the letters because we didn't know that they were digitizing them yet. And so we spent a lot of time over there, but there's so much interesting stuff. A lot of the letters are, I think all of them are amazing, and some of them for different reasons, but there's a lot that are, there's kind of two camps of letters. There's the, way to go, Governor Spry, thank you for sticking it to Joe Hill, and then there's the outrage letters, and the outrage letters far outnumber the happy ones, happy ones. Those ones happen to be written by guys like David O. McKay, though, so I'm sure they carried a lot more weight with the governor than, random miner from West Virginia, because there's a bunch of those. But I wanted to talk about this letter because we came across this one, and this is just in one of the boxes over there. And so I want to talk about this one in particular because it's just... it's a phenomenal letter. It's 2 pages, and there's so much in this. I think if somebody were to really unpack everything that's in this letter, it could be a whole book. I went ahead and transcribed it. I just want to read this to you guys, and so this gets really down in the weeds. But so it's written September 28th, 1915, from Garfield, Utah. It's to the governor. Dear sir, among the circumstances in the persecution of Joseph Hillstrom, there is yet to my knowledge one person who as yet has not been brought into this case, namely. At the time of the murder of Morris and his son, Joseph Hillstrom, together with his partner Applequist, lived with the Azaleas family in Murray. And so when he said that, it was like, okay, well, this guy at least knows, that was in the papers, and so, that's not super interesting. Then he says, Mrs. Azaleas' niece Hilda at this time kept company with Applequist, and the mother, on Christmas Eve previous to the murder, introduced him, Applequist, to me as her intended son-in-law. It's like, okay, well, so this guy's got some kind of in with this family if he's being introduced to Hilda. And like Hilda, she's everybody wondered if she was the woman that Joe Hill was keeping quiet about, and the Salt Lake Tribune went crazy with that angle in their stories. Like, is it her? Is it her? Nobody knew. And so he's naming Hilda, so she'd kind of been in the papers and stuff, but he was close enough to the family that he'd met them. And he says the mother, as well as her daughter at the time, were members of the Socialist Party of Murray City. It seems like everybody in Murray was a member of the Socialist. Everybody in Murray seems to have been a member of the Socialist Party there at the time. But All these people in question could have been at the time of the murder in Salt Lake City, where the quarrel, according to Hillstrom, took place. Well, that line was the first thing that really piqued our interest, because Joe never said where the quarrel took place. You know, he went to the doctor and said, I got in a fight with a woman, and after I got in a fight with a friend about a woman, and that was the end of it. That's all he said. He never said. It's like, well, wait a minute. Is it possible that this guy knows something that the cops don't? Consequently, as Hillstrom and his family were strong friends, fraternity brothers, and countrymen, it is only natural to suppose that Hillstrom will not bring them into the case at any price. Well, everybody wonders why Joe didn't speak up and save himself, or why he didn't say who these people were, or why friends didn't come forward. Well, this guy knows. He tells us right here. It's because of these bonds that he has with these people. He doesn't want to drag them into his mess. And so this is the closest that exists from the time, is something that explains Joe's silence, other than just him not talking, right? And so with great precaution, inquire the girl Hilda, as she takes all her advice from her cousins, the Asalius boys, and I shall be very glad indeed if this information could throw but one ray of light on this much interesting case. Very respectfully, Olaf Lindegren, Arthur Plant, Garfield, Utah. So at this point we're like, well, who the hell is Olaf Lindegren? Like, how does he know all this stuff? Like, the cops don't know anything, the governor doesn't know anything, his lawyers don't know anything. Like, nobody knows anything. Who's this Olaf Lindegren guy? So we decided we wanted to try to figure out who he was. Let's see. I went too far. That's Olaf Lindegren. We figured out who he was. We got on like FamilySearch.com or something like that, and got in and figured out how to do the family trees, and we found a living descendant. And another guy that we never heard of. And so my boss told me, she's like, well, you got to find this guy. And so I Google his, start off with just a Google. I Google his name, and the first link that pops up is a Salt Lake Tribune story from a week and a half earlier. He had talked to Kirk Cragthorpe, our sports writer, because he used to be a team manager for the Bees, like in the 40s. Yeah, no, it wouldn't have been the 40s. He wouldn't have been old enough. But anyway, he used to work for the Bees, and we were doing some look back at, remember how awesome that team was or whatever. And it's like, so I called Kurt. And like, hey, Kurt, I need to get a hold of this Roger guy. You talked to him. It's like, oh yeah, he lives in the Bay Area. He's the nicest guy. So I call him, and I don't know how this guy's going to react to me calling and saying, hey, I've got this letter that was written by your grandfather. This guy's in his, the guy in the Bay Area, he's in his 80s. And so I call him, and I started explaining this letter to him, and I kind of wanted to back into it, because as we were, an experience we had multiple times is like as we were trying to find living descendants of the people that were peripherally involved in the case, because we wanted to see if there were family stories or pictures we could get or things like that. We had some people get kind of grouchy with us when we suggested that maybe their ancestors had been these lefty labor radicals and hell-bent on destroying capitalism, and they didn't want to hear that about Grandma. And so I'm totally backing into what this letter is. And so I call him, and I'm like, hey, this is Jeremy from the Salt Lake Tribune. And he's like, oh, yeah, I just talked to Kurt. You guys got more questions about the Bees? No, I don't. And so I was like, well, I found this letter that was written by your grandfather. And he's like, no, that can't be. He's like, he's some dumb immigrant. He didn't know how to write English. Like, what are you don't have a letter from? I was like, well, maybe it wasn't written by him, but he signed it. And it turns out it was written by him. He had some other, but anyway. I was like, well, it's a letter. He's like, well, what's this letter? Why are you calling me about this letter? I was like, well, it's a letter he wrote to the governor. He's like, what? Grandpa was a smelter worker. What's he writing to the governor for? He's like, well, it's about this really controversial court case that was happening in Utah when he was alive. And I said that, and he just goes, it's about Joe Hill, isn't it? And I about dropped the phone. And I was like, well, actually, yeah, it is. And he's like, my mom used to tell me about Joe all the time, because, he lived next door, and he would come over with his guitar, and he'd sing songs with my uncles. and I'm about to die. Like I can't even believe this. And so the paper let me fly down to meet with him, and we recorded a video of him, you know, his memories of his mom telling him about Joe coming to the house and singing, going out and drinking with his uncles, you know, like just something else. But the thing that he gave us that you know, other than the pictures, so this the guy that I tracked down, that's his mother. She's 14 in this picture. This picture was taken in 1916. You know, they're a very poor family. This is the only, you know, there's a, let me see if I, so this is the whole photo. This is the whole family, like the uncles are in this picture, everybody's in this picture. The thing that he gave me that was really fascinating, gave so much context that is like missing from a lot of the biographies that are out there, was he gave me a memoir that his mother wrote shortly before she died of what it was like growing up in Burgertown, you know, the Swedish part of Murray, in this time period, and the poverty they describe, and the like what brought them there, and everything. Like it's so interesting. Just really brief, I don't know how much time I have left, so I'll just really briefly go through Olaf. So he's born in 1859 in Stockholm. He was born out of wedlock, so that's a huge taboo. You know, his mother's kind of ostracized. His mother eventually gets married to another guy who isn't too hip on Olaf because, you know, born out of wedlock and they've got other kids, so he likes those kids more. So Olaf decides he's had enough, and he leaves home when he's 12 years old. And by the time he's 16, he's in the Swedish Army. That's how old you had to be to join up. And so when he turned 16, he joined the Swedish Army, and his assignment was he was a palace guard at the Royal Palace in Stockholm. At this point, he changes his name. He assumes the name Lindegren, which in Swedish, I guess, means the beautiful castle on the green, surrounded by the greenery, or something like that. And so he names himself after the palace where he's working. And when he gets out of the army, he meets his wife, who is she's sitting here, and they get married. Well, in 1890, it happens a lot, you know, with Utah stories. Anna, his wife, joins the LDS Church. Olaf isn't into it, but they really want to immigrate to the United States. You know, poverty conditions are really terrible in Sweden. They want to come to the United States. They want to go to Minnesota and live in the big Swedish community there, but they don't have any money. But hey, the church has got this thing called the Perpetual Immigration Fund. They'll give you some money and you can come to Salt Lake. And, you know, this is the land of milk and honey, and, you know, you come over here and everything's going to be awesome. Well, so he leaves Sweden, where, again, he's, you know, been working at the palace, and he ends up in the smelters in Murray. That's different, you know, and when he saves up enough money to bring over the rest of the family, this memoir that we have, this little girl talks about remembering just seeing her mother sitting at the table and crying, and like so regretting leaving Sweden. And that to me is really interesting because like that Summons, the Oscar Larson, he was really pissed off that the Mormons tricked him into leaving Sweden too. You know, like that was a huge thing in his right. Like he was really involved in Joe's defense. He was a member of the Swedish socialist organizations here in town, and later he's in the Communist Party and he gets deported because, you know, that's a super popular thing to be involved in Utah, and so they ship him back home. Well, when he gets back home, he writes a lot of stuff about the Joe Hill case, and it's published all over in Sweden. And I don't speak Swedish, I don't read it, but I know a guy over there now, and so he translated a bunch of the stuff for me and sent it over. And this betrayal that, like, a lot of these folks felt when the missionaries were coming in, and apparently some of these missionaries were telling these Swedish pioneers that when you get to Utah, you're going to be beloved, we're going to give you all this land, everything's going to be amazing, you're going to be wealthy because, you know, we're so prosperous in Zion. And then they get over here and they're working in the smelter. You know, that happens, and it doesn't take long kind of figure out that you've been sold a bit of a bill of goods on this, and everybody's kind of mad about it. And so to me, like, this letter, like, and finding all this other stuff, and him saying, Joe's not going to talk because of his loyalty to his countrymen, I mean, that starts to make a lot of sense. Like, all the power structures in Utah have squished you. Like, you've left your homeland. Like, this is the property they left behind in Sweden when they came over. This is a heck of a lot different than living in one of the little crap shacks out by the smelter where, everybody has cancer because it's so polluted. Like, it's just so different. And so when the state comes around and is saying, hey, Joe, you can tell us what happened that night. Tell us, you can trust us. Just tell us everybody who was involved. Who's going to believe that? And so to me, like, finding this letter in the state archive, it's just been sitting in a box for 100 years. We find this letter and we were trying to figure out who this guy was, and it led us to all this other context that I think really helps unpack a part of the mystery. Like, suddenly it's less mysterious. And so thank God that letter got saved. To me, that's the importance of having these archives and stuff like that. Like, somehow the paper has let me go all over the country digging through old IWW archives trying to unpack this story. And every trip I go on, there's some new piece. There's some new little thing you find that just opens up this whole new thing. And anyway, I get really excited about this story. So I'm probably about out of time. So, I have 5 minutes. Being prompted to use them. It's a little bit about their life in Murray, I guess. In this memoir, Edith, Edith here, like there was a day that her father was able to save enough money to take her to the state fair. They had to get on the trolley, go out to the fairgrounds, and that was all the money they had. She talks about how she didn't get to go on a merry-go-round ride. She didn't get to have a lemonade, any of that kind of stuff. They just walked around and looked at the stuff that was free because they could afford the train ticket to get there, and they could afford the admission, and that was it, nothing else. And it was a huge deal. It was the one time that she got to go. It wasn't a family outing. It was her and her dad, all that. And her souvenir, she's writing about this when she's 83 years old. She was a little girl when this happened, and she still remembers this. This is what she's writing about. She gets a thimble from the Singer Sewing Machine Company because she knows her mom needs a thimble. And so that's her souvenir from the fair. I take my kids to the fair and we're doing face painting and we're coming home with stuffed animals and we're eating God knows what. It's totally different. And so to go from this life where, you think you're coming over here because you're going to be joining the saints in Zion, to just being put into this community where everything is terrible all the time, I think understanding that is really crucial to understanding why these folks wouldn't come forward and tell the cops anything that happened. There's other letters that we've come across where they talk about specific police persecution against the community. Like one of the really interesting things to me is there's an article in the Tribune that talks about how the cops are having such a hard time investigating this murder because they go down to the Murray and everybody speaks Swedish and none of the cops speak Swedish. What are we going to do? Okay, that's a bunch of crap. There were cops on the force who were Swedish immigrants. There's stories about them working as court interpreters for when people in Murray get arrested and they need somebody to interpret. And so the cops come in and they're the court interpreters. Where are all these cops? Well, they were there. Like we found another personal memoir from a woman who was in the community who talks about all the Swedish cops coming in and just hassling everybody. So what on earth is the Tribune doing saying that, or why are the cops telling the Tribune that there's no Swedish-speaking cops? There's a whole litany of them, and we wrote about them. Why weren't we calling them on that? So that became part of the legend, is that The cops had such a hard time because of this language barrier. There was no language barrier. There were too many immigrants in this valley from all over the world. There were zero language barriers. It's too easy to find. It's like now, you got returned missionaries who've been all over the place. And if there was a murder several years ago and we needed somebody who spoke Karen to help, and there's a whole bunch of people who speak Karen. It's the only place outside of Cambodia where there's a whole bunch of people who speak this, and especially like non-native speakers. Like, I don't know. I could go on about that for quite a while, but anyway, to me, that's the value of having these archives. Like, if we hadn't stumbled across this letter and wondered who this guy was, we wouldn't have found this whole other thing that just added so much context and so much nuance to the story and made it a lot more understandable. Anyway, I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
So one of the frustrating things about coming to conferences like this is you see all the things you could be doing better about your professional practice as a teacher or a historian or a combination of things. And just listening to James and Jeremy, I have like a million more ideas. So my name is Quinn Rollins, and I taught Utah history at Benyon Junior High in Taylorsville for 10 years. For the last 5 years, I've been the social studies curriculum specialist for Granite School District, which means I do curriculum development and I train teachers and I try to find resources for teachers and try to help teachers find more ways to reach their kids. I've been involved with the Utah Council for the Social Studies. I was the 2011 Secondary Teacher of the Year for them. I received the 2015 National Council for the Social Studies Best of the West Award. Been the director of some Teaching American History grants and been involved in National Endowment for the Humanities grants, presented at a lot of national conferences. But what matters most to me is that first part, is being a teacher, is working with 12 and 13-year-olds, especially with Utah history, to help them understand why they're living where they're living. In the current climate, we have a lot of kids who have moved here last year from someplace else, and they're like, well, I'm only in Utah for a year. I'm not going to be here a year from now. And I want them to know how their story intersects with Utah's story and how there's a piece of them in Utah's story. And I think Joe Hill's story does a very good job of helping them see that, which sounds really negative and horrible, actually, now that I say it that way. But their story hopefully ends better. How many of you are teachers or have been teachers? Anybody? Okay. So one of my secret goals is to get more of the Utah history teachers that are teaching 7th grade and 4th grade to come to this conference. So if you have ideas for how to make that happen, yeah, I'm all ears. So I didn't learn about Joe Hill when I was in 7th grade. When I was in 7th grade, we read the chapter, we answered the questions at the end of the chapter, we moved on to the next chapter. We didn't explore, we didn't do history, we heard about history from somebody, and then, I got an A in the class and I remembered nothing about it the next semester. So I probably was introduced to Joe Hill via Ken Verdoya, and which is a great introduction, but I wanted to do a better job of teaching my 7th graders than I was taught when I was a kid. Some challenges that all teachers face is I had probably one 50-minute class period that I could use to teach Joe Hill to my students. It's a topic that could take a week of those class periods, but I had about 55 minutes. I had 37 students in that class, 37 12-year-olds who I want to learn about a guy who died 100 years ago. And it gets to the point where there are so many great resources, so many great stories, so many primary sources, so many really quality secondary sources that you have to just pick just the right ones and really end up being concise. You don't have time to go for a deep dive, so you want to kind of get the most bang for your buck. So with Joe Hill, I used primary sources in 4 different ways. One is to set the stage for what's happening. One is to look at the case, the criminal case he was involved in. Third is to look at the reactions to the case, and then fourth is to look at the legacy. Before getting to this point in a Utah Studies course, we've already looked at the struggle for statehood, we've looked at mining, we've looked at conflicts between Mormons and non-Mormons, we've looked at Utah sort of trying to assimilate into the rest of the Union, and we looked at immigration. And Joe Hill's story touches on all 5 of those things. For building the background for the Joe Hill story, the way I used primary sources was mostly with the history of the IWW. Used political cartoons, used union posters, used pamphlets, looked at the different ways that unions were sending their messages around that time period, and exploring with the kids what a union was, why you would want to be part of a union, why you wouldn't like the goals of a union, and because they are children and they feel powerless all day long, they really like to rally around union causes, it turns out. I try to connect it to students as much as possible, and I'll return to that in just a minute. I would use the primary sources to build personal background on Joe Hill. We looked at some of his songs. We actually sang Preacher and the Slave because, well, it has a powerful message, and it had a message that 12-year-olds understand. One of the verses is, if you fight hard for children and a wife, try to get something good in this life, you're a sinner and bad man, they tell. When you die, you will sure go to hell. And part of it is I wanted to see if 12-year-olds would say the word hell, and they did, and they sang it really super loud. And I always had to tell my teacher neighbor, oh, today's the day we're singing Joe Hill songs, and yeah, they appreciated the warning. And there was always one kid that just mouthed it. You know, they wouldn't actually say the word. They're just like, but anyway, kids are cute. So we sang Preacher and the Slave. Joe Hill was also a cartoonist. He made some political cartoons himself, some of which weren't published until after his death. So we looked at some of those. I wanted them to meet the person Joe Hill before they knew anything about the crime he was accused of. Then to get to... when he got to the crime itself, there's a good 3-page narrative of the story, and it happened in Utah, which is from Gahan and Tom Wharton from the Salt Lake Tribune. And it is, I gave them that just as a secondary source and had them do a T-chart where they look at evidence that they see in that little text that says Joe Hill was innocent and evidence that says he was guilty. After they see if they think he's innocent or guilty, then I would add a few primary sources, a few statements from people. There is a site, joehill.org, that has some of the court statements and interviews, the witness statements that kids can use to see where the narrative comes from and see what the actual court language, the court documents are. There's also a case map on that same site that has about 30 different events and where they happened in Salt Lake City, so that kids can sort of get an idea of the layout of where the events happened. From there, from looking at the case itself, including the appeal up to the Utah Supreme Court, then we would go to the letters that James was talking about, where you have letters to Governor Spry that are asking for clemency. What's the word? What am I thinking of? To commute the sentence, and letters that were saying we're glad that you got him. and sort of having the kids analyze the relative power of the people who are asking for different things from the governor. And I always like throwing in the telegraph or the letter from Virginia Snow Stevens, where she's a daughter of a Mormon president of the LDS Church. It's interesting to have a liberal Mormon or previously Mormon woman in there. After we look at the case, after we look at the evidence for and against Joe Hill's innocence, then I let them know that he was found guilty and he was executed, and they're really super bummed out about that. And so the final thing we do is we sing the song "I Dreamt I Saw Joe Hill Last Night," and because I guess I'm all about singing for that particular lesson plan. The next day we come back and we have the kids connected to their own lives, where they look at the school and they look at their school day and they look for something they would change in the school, and they have to form a union of 6 kids, and that union has to make a poster advocating for the change in the school. And I tell them it has to be a positive change. They can't do something like get rid of all math classes or something. They can't get rid of a certain teacher, but advocating for a positive change. And then I have the principal come down and they evaluate those union posters. Would those kids get what they're asking for or not? And a couple of times they did. But in those ways, I think that kids see the relevance of unions to people who feel like they don't have power. They understand having an advocate like Joe Hill. They understand the more personal parts of his story. And then adding those primary sources to it, adding the letters from real people, adding the details of the court case, adding his songs, his music to it, really helps them understand Joe Hill's role in that, and also their role in Utah and Utah's history. The 3 resources that I used most, or recommend the most, there's that joehill.org, which is from Ron Yangich, and his law class. They're the ones that started that. James has made everything a lot easier at State Archives. I did go through and find all those letters and telegrams and stuff separately, and now they're all beautifully organized. There are also a lot of other kind of siloed, organized things on State Archives right now. So if you happen to be a Utah history teacher, there are a lot of sort of, things are easier to find than they were 10 years ago. And then the Salt Lake Tribune, along with what Jeremy was talking about, so all that stuff came out in 2015 for the centennial, and it's still there on a Legacy of Joe Hill page that is always there on the Salt Lake Tribune site. It's been there since 2015. I don't think it's going anywhere. Pat Bagley also has a sort of a 6-page, it's basically a 6-page graphic novel or comic book that is the story of Joe Hill. So as a teacher of junior high kids, that has become invaluable. But we have some time still, so if there are questions.
So my understanding is we'll have a microphone that can go out. If anyone has any questions, we are happy to. Okay. I believe this gentleman.
Yes, my name is Jack Billings, and I'm wondering if either of you saw a piece that I submitted to Holly George. Maybe you didn't. If not, okay. Oh boy. Listen to that. Where to begin? My granddad stood a trial in 1912, which you could almost call a dress rehearsal for Joe Hill's case 3 years later. He had the same attorney, Orrin Hilton, that he had it for his whole trial, where Joe Hill, Orrin Hilton only acted as his appeals attorney. And by that time, the case had been so muddied that it didn't really go anywhere. Well, it tried, but it still did not. I had heard that my granddad knew Joe Hill. I'd heard that from my parents. Now, I'm legally blind. I attended a convention of the Utah Council of the Blind, and one of the speakers that they had at one of these conventions was our bookseller, Sam Weller. He came out and said that he had known and had been a business neighbor to Alfred Sorensen and named him as Joe Hill's father confessor. Have any of you seen or heard anything? Are there
Alfred
any
Sorensen.
letters from Alfred Sorensen?
So Alfred Sorensen was your grandfather?
Yes.
I want to talk to you.
Yes, I suspected you would.
I do.
Now, I contacted, before he died, I asked Mr. Weller where he thought, because while
I have a transcript of an interview with your grandfather that was done in the mid-1940s that I think you'll really be interested in seeing.
Okay. Excellent. I guess let's leave it at that. Other than that, what do you see? That whole period of history goes, how could we say, both ways. There were people who testified, one of whom was related to someone who was into Utah history big time. You would recognize her name, except for that her relative was listed as one of the most unreliable witnesses that the courts had dealt with in this period, 1912, 1915. Prior to that, and at one time I lived in Idaho, and part of the thing that I have not seen or heard a linkage to, there was an attempt made on William Spry's life. It did not succeed.
I've got some information on that too I can share with you.
Prior to that, in Idaho, they had assassinated the governor up there.
Yeah.
And that would have been fresh in everybody's mind down here.
Yes.
You know, any governor in the West that had a mining history and labor activity, which up there was in the silver mines.
Yeah, that certainly weighed heavy on their minds, yeah.
You know, wow. It's fascinating history, and it gets a lot more violent in many cases, like hanging people up in Butte, Montana,
Yeah.
a little bit later. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question, Mr. Rollins. My name is Megan. I work for State History, and forgive my ignorance, I don't know a lot about the education system in Utah. I'm just curious if you've ever run into any trouble with parents on unionizing students, because it's awesome, but I'm just wondering if you've had any other troubles or hit any roadblocks with that.
Well, this comes a few weeks after teaching the Mountain Meadows Massacre, so this is nothing. No, well, honestly, no. It didn't ever come up. Part of it, I think, is that we also talk about the good parts about unionizing, the bad parts about unionizing, when it's practical, when it isn't, what are different ways to send your message. You know, but they aren't radicalized yet. We get there by the end of the school year.
I feel really stupid because today is the first day I've ever even heard of Joe Hill, and I came in here because I was like, what's the big deal about Joe Hill? I mean, I probably heard about it in high school, I don't remember and stuff, but
You probably didn't hear about it in high school.
Oh.
A lot of the curriculum ends at statehood. It just happened 20 years later.
Oh, okay. So, what is the big significance of him? I mean, like, was he later found not guilty after he was executed, or what? Why is he such a big thing, a big person that they're all talking about right now?
So he's been a big person that they've been talking about since probably like 1910, 1912-ish. Like, he's been a big deal for a long time. He became a much bigger deal in Utah when he was arrested. One of the things that's, man, I could go on about this for like 5 hours, but one of the things that's really interesting to know is when they first arrested him, they thought he was somebody else. And then they found out, they realized who they had. Like oh, we've got that Joe Hill guy, he's the songwriter for that union. The union had been having like, the fight that had been going on to end them. Like, it's almost every major city in the western United States and a bunch of cities in the east too. I mean, these are just like violent blow-ups. Like cops just really killing people, and beating them and jailing them, and like there's been such a concentrated effort on just wiping them out. Like in Salt Lake City for a while, it was illegal for them to hold meetings or to speak or do anything. Joe Hill's execution comes at the end of like 4 years of just like all kinds of fights between state authorities and this particular labor group, and it wasn't unique to Salt Lake City. In Boise, the governor was assassinated, and they tried to pin it on these IWW guys. They weren't even really involved. It was a different union group. So there's all this. And then when Joe was arrested and was charged with murder, the union basically went nuts. And there was this huge letter writing campaign, and all of a sudden all this controversy. And then when he was executed, there were riots in other parts of the world when he was executed. And then he's remembered probably more than other labor activists at the time, specifically because of his songwriting. A lot of his songs have gone on to be part of the American folk canon. He was a big influence on guys like Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, Bob Dylan. And if you pull those guys out of the American Songbook, a huge portion of it collapses. And so there's so many different ways people can be interested in him. And then his story, he touched on this too. It's like, there's anti-immigrant stuff in the book, which is still relevant. There's a lot of racism in it. It's still relevant. It's the haves and the have-nots. If you go back and you read some of these old speeches, and you got to jump to the end to make sure that you're not reading Bernie Sanders. It's the same rhetoric. And so all these issues that these guys are fighting for are unresolved, and a lot of people are still fighting for them. And so it's made his the story is as relevant today as it was 100 years ago, because it's the same conversation. Like the national debate going on right now. Every part of it, there's an element of it in the story of the IWW in the West. So it's just really fascinating.
And I would add to that, you can really get kind of hands-on with it by actually going into the primary source materials. You really get a sense of how people felt both for and against Joe Hill from the letters people wrote. This is pre-internet age. The main mode of communication is through correspondence. It's kind of a lost art now, and you can really get a sense of exactly how people felt about Joe Hill from their letters.
Yeah, there's a letter over there that kind of cracks me up where it's a guy who is like so sick of these IWW guys going around that he's like, I understand that you guys are going to kill him. I'll save you some money. I have a gun. If you guys will help me get to Salt Lake City, I'll kill him for you. Like you don't have to hire the firing squad to come out. I'll come out and do it for you. It'll just be a favor to the state of Utah. And it's some of these letters. It's like an internet comment board on a news article, a controversial news article. It's just like it's so hyperbolized. Like so. That's not the word I'm looking for. So polarized. Like you're all like, it's really nice.
You could also add into that we are currently wrestling with the issue of how legitimate the actions of our police force are. Back then, one of the incidents that happened, it's in a book by Philip Foner, that the Salt Lake police, they instigated a riot.
Yeah, and that
they
was
had
one of the...
They had people from the emergency police hospital unit that was down like where the library square is now. Supposedly the speaker, a socialist, a progressive, had caused the riot, and no, it was a police officer who caused the riot.
Yeah, it was an IWW street meeting, and it was, for lack of a better word, it's what happened. It got attacked by a bunch of people who had been deputized, but they were also company guards for the Utah Construction Company, which was David Eccles. That's fascinating.
I'm curious about when you teach this to the students, if they have an opinion about whether or not Joe Hill was guilty of murder.
We do a vote sort of at the end of class, and usually out of 7 classes, 6 of them say he's innocent, and the others say guilty. And part of that is what they're reading, but part of it is they like the guy, they like his goals. Some of them like the bad boy anyway. So I don't know. It is interesting to see what kind of evidence they think they're seeing, and they try to go CSI on it, and something you can't completely do, but they like to find the evidence.
Have either of you, I was told by 2 friends of mine, women who were just slightly older than I am, who were classmates to one of the Morrison family, one Marilyn Morrison.
Yeah.
You have talked to her?
This is a funny story, but Marilyn and I are actually relatives, distantly.
All right.
One of the cops who helped with the investigation, it's my 3rd great grandfather, second. My last name's Harmon. There was a guy named Jesse Harmon who helped with the investigation. His cousin was John Morrison's widow.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've talked. The Morrisons are talking to them has been amazing too. I've spent a lot of time with Merlin Morrison, and his father was also named Merlin, but Merlin was the 13-year-old boy who witnessed his father be killed, and he was a witness at the trial. And so it's been really interesting to talk to them and get their family's perspective on all of it.
Yes, one of these women, Quinn, I believe was it William Adler or Alder, had a book out most recently. When that book came out, she got a copy of it, took it to Marilyn Morrison, and she almost blew up on her.
Yeah. Yeah, Marilyn's not a fan of that book. I've heard that too.
Well, if we don't have any more questions, thank you all for your attendance.